What if one single decision by the most powerful Republican in Congress left nearly 800,000 Americans without a voice overnight? What if a federal judge didn't just disagree, but openly said the Speaker of the House abused his power? That's exactly what just happened, and the fallout is sending shockwaves through MAGA world. This was a quiet ruling buried in legal paperwork. This was a courtroom moment that blew the doors off Washington. In a stunning showdown, Mike Johnson walked into court confident and walked out politically exposed. The judge didn't soften the blow. He used words so severe that legal experts are calling it one of the most damaging rebukes a sitting speaker has faced in modern history. And within hours, MAGA influencers, insiders, and allies began turning on each other. Now the movement is split, angry, and searching for someone to blame. Was the judge the enemy, or did Johnson cross a line he going to come back from? Stay with me, because what happened next could change how power works in Congress forever. What made this moment explode across political media wasn't just that Mike Johnson lost in court, it was how badly he lost. Federal judges are famously cautious with their words. They don't grandstand, they don't insult, and they almost never use emotionally charged language towards sitting government officials. That's why this ruling hit like a political earthquake. The judge didn't hide behind legal technicalities. Instead, he openly called Johnson's actions constitutionally indefensible and a flagrant abuse of authority. Those are not routine phrases. Those are career-damaging words. To put this simply, judges usually say, "This argument fails," or "the court disagrees." What they do not do is accuse the Speaker of the House of abusing power in plain English. That kind of language signals something very serious. The court believed Johnson didn't just make a mistake. He crossed a line he knew existed. Legal experts immediately pointed out that this wording leaves almost no room for spin, appeals, or excuses. It tells the public that the judge saw this as a clear violation, not a gray area. And here's where the drama really kicks in. When a ruling sounds this harsh, it sends a message beyond the courtroom. It tells lawmakers, party leaders, and even voters that the behavior wasn't just questionable, it was unacceptable under the Constitution. That's why MAGA world reacted so violently. You can argue with a technical loss. You can easily defend being accused of abusing power by a federal judge. This wasn't a quiet legal defeat buried in paperwork. It was a public humiliation delivered in language designed to be understood by everyone. And once those words hit the record, the political damage was already done. At the heart of this courtroom disaster was one fatal mistake. Mike Johnson acted as if the Speaker of the House has personal unchecked power. That assumption is exactly what the judge rejected forcefully. The U.S. Constitution does not give one individual the authority to decide who gets representation in Congress. Power like that belongs to the entire House, not one politician, no matter how powerful his title sounds. This is where Johnson's argument completely collapsed. He claimed that as Speaker, he had broad discretion to delay or block the seating of a duly elected member, but the Constitution is very clear. Elections are judged by the full body of Congress through established procedures, committees, and votes, not behind closed doors, not by personal preference, and definitely not because it results politically inconvenient. The judge made it clear that Johnson didn't just bend the rules, he ignored them entirely. Think about how dangerous that logic would be if it were allowed to stand. If one speaker can block a Democrat today, what stops a future speaker from blocking Republicans tomorrow? That's why the court stepped in so quickly. This wasn't just about one seat. It was about stopping a power grab before it became a precedent. The judge essentially said, "This is not how representative democracy works." And that's what made this ruling so explosive. Johnson wasn't accused of misinterpreting a technical rule. He was accused of cutting out the democratic process itself. Courts are especially sensitive to that kind of behavior because once individual officials start acting alone, checks and balances begin to crumble. In simple terms, Johnson tried to play king, and the Constitution reminded me, isn't it one? This is the part of the story that made the judge act fast and made the backlash so intense because this case wasn't just about politics or party games. It was about real people losing their voice in government. When Mike Johnson blocked a duly E-lead member from being seated, he didn't just target one politician. He effectively cut off representation for nearly 800,000 Americans in a single stroke. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of voters showed up, cast their ballots, followed the rules, and won their election only to be told their voices didn't count. No vote on the budget, and no say in major legislation, no representation during critical debates that directly affect their lives. In a representative democracy, that's not just a problem. That's a constitutional emergency. Judges take this kind of harm extremely seriously because every day without representation causes irreversible damage. Laws get passed, budgets get approved, decisions get locked in. You can't rewind that time. And the judge made it clear that Johnson's actions didn't just inconvenience voters, they actively denied them their constitutional rights. That's why the court didn't drag this out. For months, speed mattered. This also shattered one of Johnson's key defenses. He tried to frame this as a temporary delay, something minor that could be sorted out later, but the judge wasn't buying it. When nearly 1 million people are left without a voice, there's nothing minor about that. The harm was happening in real time. And this is where the moral weight of the ruling really landed. You can argue about procedure, you can argue about power, but once the focus shifts to silence voters, the argument collapses. That's when this case stopped being political and became undeniable. This is where the case went from bad to absolutely devastating for Mike Johnson. Courts don't just look at what someone did, they look at why they did it. And in this ruling, the judge made a finding that shattered Johnson's entire defense. This wasn't about election integrity or caution, it was about raw political advantage. According to the judge, the evidence showed that Johnson's decision to block the elected member wasn't driven by unanswered questions or legal uncertainty. It was driven by vote math. By keeping that seat empty, Johnson protected his party's narrow margins during crucial votes. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in constitutional law. When an official acts for partisan gain, courts stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. This is why the ruling hits so hard. If Johnson had been able to argue uncertainty, confusion, or procedural delay, he might have survived politically, but once a judge says the motive was to manipulate outcomes, the argument collapses. That's no longer a policy dispute. That's an abuse of power, and judges are trained to shut that down immediately. Even more damaging, this finding stripped away the MAGA talking point that this was about protecting democracy. A court essentially said the opposite. Democracy was the victim, not the excuse. That's a brutal reversal, especially for a movement that constantly claims moral high ground on elections. This is also why the backlash inside MAGA became so vicious. Once the ruling framed Johnson as acting out of self-interest, he stopped looking like a warrior and started looking like a liability. Some defended him, others turned on him instantly, but none of them could erase what was now written into the legal record. Because when a federal judge says your actions were politically motivated, that label sticks. One of the most damaging parts of this entire saga wasn't the criticism for Democrats or liberal commentators. It was who agreed with the judge. When conservative legal experts started saying the ruling was correct, Mike Johnson lost the last line of defense he had in politics. You can survive partisan outrage. What you cannot survive is losing your own side's legal credibility. Several right-leaning constitutional scholars and former federal prosecutors publicly admitted what many were already thinking. Johnson's argument was legally doomed from the start. They pointed out that the Constitution is not vague on this issue. When voters elect someone, that person is seated unless the entire House follows formal procedures to challenge the election. Skipping those steps isn't a clever tactic. It's a violation, and conservative lawyers know that as well as anyone. This mattered because it shattered the MAGA narrative of a rogue judge or deep state plot. That argument only works if your own experts back you up. But when conservative analysts say no, this judge got it right, the story collapses. Suddenly, this wasn't left versus right. It was law versus overreach. What made it even worse was how blunt these critiques were. Some conservatives openly said that any competent lawyer should have warned Johnson he would lose. That's devastating because it reframes the loss as avoidable incompetence, not bad luck. It suggests this wasn't a trap. It was a reckless gamble. And once that idea took hold, MAGA anger shifted direction, and instead of uniting against the court, parts of the movement turned inward, asking why their speaker walked straight into a legal buzzsaw. That's when loyalty started cracking, because when even your own side admits you were wrong, outrage turns into blame, and blame is politically fatal. What happened after the ruling might be even more damaging than the ruling itself. Instead of uniting behind Mike Johnson, Magaro fractured instantly. Within hours, conservative media, influencers, and activists were openly fighting each other, and that kind of public infighting is a nightmare for any political movement built on loyalty and discipline. One faction went into full attack mode against the judge. They claimed the ruling was part of a deep state conspiracy, demanded Johnson ignore the order, and called for open defiance of the courts. This group saw the decision not as a legal loss, but as a declaration of war. To them, backing down would mean surrender. The rhetoric got loud, emotional, and extreme, and it spread fast. But another faction turned their anger directly on Johnson himself. Instead of seeing him as a victim, they saw him as weak. They argued he never should have let the issue reach a courtroom in the first place. In their eyes, a real MAGA fighter doesn't lose, especially not this publicly. Some even questioned whether Johnson deserved to remain Speaker at all. That's a stunning reversal for someone who was supposed to be Trump's most reliable ally in Congress. This split created an impossible situation. If Johnson follows the court order, he enrages the defiance crowd. If he resists, he risks further legal humiliation and deeper damage. There is no path that satisfies everyone, and MAGA knows it. That's why the reaction turned chaotic instead of coordinated. And here's the key takeaway. Movements built on absolute loyalty don't handle failure well. The moment a leader shows weakness, unity collapses. What we're watching isn't just outrage. It's as a movement struggling to decide who to blame when the system says no. By now, this story feels familiar because it is. What's happening to Mike Johnson fits a repeating pattern that has defined modern megapolitics. Total loyalty is demanded, but failure is never forgiven. You could defend the movement every day, echo every talking point, and sacrifice your own reputation, but the moment you lose, you're on your own. Time and time again, leaders who tied themselves completely to Trump learned this the hard way. The rule is simple and brutal. Results matter more than loyalty. As long as you're winning, you're protected. The second the courts, the system, or reality push back, the movement turns cold. Excuses disappear, support evaporates, and suddenly you're the problem. Johnson followed the playbook perfectly. He positioned himself as the most reliable MAGA ally in Congress. He blocked, delayed, defended, and echoed without hesitation. But none of that mattered. Once a federal judge rolled against him overnight, loyalty turned into suspicion. Strength turned into weakness, and devotion turned into doubt. What makes this pattern so dangerous is that it creates reckless decision-making. Leaders feel pressure to push boundaries, ignore warnings, and gamble big because backing down looks worse than losing. That's likely what happened here. Johnson didn't just miscalculate the law, he miscalculated the movement. He assumed loyalty would protect him. History says otherwise. And once MAGA senses vulnerability, it doesn't close racks. It searches for a scapegoat. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Some are Cohen Johnson betrayed. Others are calling him incompetent. Very few are defending the decision itself. This is why this moment matters beyond one court case. It exposes a system where leaders are encouraged to go too far, then abandon when consequences arrive. Johnson didn't just lose a legal fight. He stepped into a political machine that consumes its own when things go wrong. This ruling didn't just hurt Mike Johnson. It set a warning shot to every future Speaker of the House. That's why MAGA insiders are panicking, because what the judge really did here was close a door that some in Congress quietly hoped to keep open. The message was clear. You cannot manipulate representation for political convenience, and courts will step in if you try. Before this case, there was a dangerous gray area some leaders believed they could exploit. Delay long enough, claim uncertainty, hide behind procedure. But the judge stripped all of that away by clearly stating that unilateral action by a speaker is unconstitutional. The court created a legal guardrail. Any future speaker who tries the same trick now faces an even faster, more brutal shutdown. With this case as precedent, that's a nightmare scenario for hardliners because precedent doesn't just apply to one party or one moment, it applies forever. This ruling makes it dramatically harder for any speaker, Republican or the Democrat, to block an elected member simply because the math is inconvenient. And that's exactly why MAGA World is furious. This wasn't just a loss, it was a rule change they can't undo. What really stings is that Johnson didn't just fail. He failed in a way that protects the system from similar abuse going forward. Courts don't often step this firmly into congressional power disputes unless they see real danger. And here the danger was obvious. If this tactic worked once, it could work again. The judge stopped that chain reaction before it started, so while Johnson may eventually see the member move on, the damage remains. This case will be cited, studied, and used as a barrier against future overreach. And for a movement that thrives on testing limits, that might be the most explosive consequence of all. In Washington, perception is power. And after this ruling, Mike Johnson didn't just lose a case, he lost authority. Speakers survive tough votes and partisan fights all the time. What they don't survive easily is being publicly embarrassed by a federal judge. That kind of loss follows you into every closed door, meeting every negotiation and every leadership test that comes after strength as speaker isn't just about the gavel. It's about projecting control, competence, and judgment. This ruling undercut all three. When a judge says you abused your power, it signals to lawmakers, including members of your own party, that you miscalculated badly. And once colleagues start questioning your judgment, your leverage evaporates. This matters because Johnson is already leading with one of the narrowest majorities in modern history. Every vote counts. Every internal disagreement matters. After this ruling, moderate Republicans have covered to push back, hesitate, or distance themselves. They can point to the court loss and say, this is exactly the kind of chaos we can afford. That weakens Johnson's hand before he even opens his mouth. It also changes how Democrats deal with him. Negotiations aren't just about policy, they're about who feels pressure. And right now, Johnson looks like the one on the defensive when a judge has already ruled that you cross constitutional lines. Your threats carry less weight and your tactics look riskier. Worst of all, this weakness is visible. It's not whispered, it's documented, it's in a court record. Political opponents don't even need to attack, they can just quote the ruling. In leadership politics, nothing is more dangerous than looking unsure, cornered, or exposed. And after this courtroom showdown, Johnson didn't walk out as a fighter. He walked out as a speaker whose authority suddenly looks fragile. This is where the consequences stretch far beyond Mike Johnson himself, because this ruling is now political ammunition. Democrats won't need to exaggerate or spin anything. They can simply point to a federal court decision and say Republicans tried to deny voters their rightful representation and got shut down for it. That's a devastating message, especially in an election cycle already dominated by concerns about democracy and rule of law. Voters don't follow procedural fights closely, but they do understand fairness. And this case is easy to explain. People voted, won, and were blocked anyway. That storyline cuts through partisan noise. It doesn't sound extreme, it sounds wrong. And when a judge backs that up in writing, it carries weight, especially with independents and moderate Republicans who value stability over chaos. This is particularly dangerous for Republicans in swing districts. Candidates will be forced to answer uncomfortable questions. Do you support what your speaker did? Do you agree with the judge? Should one politician be able to silence an entire district? Those aren't easy questions to dodge without alienating someone. Any answer risks angering either the MAGA base or general election voters. Older voters, in particular, tend to react strongly to institutional breakdowns. They remember norms, they care about process, and when they hear that a court had to step in to stop a power grab, it reinforces fears that politics has gone too far. That's not a winning environment for a party trying to expand. It's coalition. Worst of all for Republicans, this story doesn't to expire. Court rulings don't disappear after a news cycle. They resurface in ads, debates, and campaign mailers long after the headlines fade. The phrase flagrant abuse of authority will still be there in black and white waiting to be quoted.